I want to introduce somebody that I've gotten close to, and that's one of the neat things about CII. It's the associations you're allowed to have. Because a lot of people, we only sit across from each other when we're negotiating a contract, we're having some issue. Sometimes they're in joint ventures, that's the good side. But here we're able to talk to each other as peers and respected professionals without the pressures of company. In fact, one of the rules is we can't even talk about a lot of the technical issues or pricing issues or things that would be sensitive as we're meeting, but we can talk about how to make the industry better. So stepping back, one that I've met is John Hewitt, and I'm going to introduce him later. And in the meantime, right now, I've got Craig Martin. And as I was talking with Craig, here I'm talking to a gentleman that I never met in the role that he had, which was president and CEO. But I'd worked with his company. In fact, I had come in on reviews where his company had worked with my company on a number of projects. And I can share that because that's not one of those secrets. One of the big ones is they're our preferred contractor at our Louisiana refinery. And as I walked in, I was walking into our company's site, and they couldn't say enough good things about his company. And that's kind of an interesting pressure situation to be put into, because usually when I'm walking in, it's because they have a whole laundry list of gripes they're trying to deal with. And so I've been able to see Craig's influence on the organization as a pass down of what he drove through an organization. I'm going to share a couple personal items about Craig as well, one of which is that he came from Kansas. And I have a brother that lives in Kansas, and as I've gone there, I asked his kids, for example, where they're going to school. My kids have gone to school all over the U.S. and from one coast to the other. Every one of his kids wants to go to Kansas, University of Kansas. If you come from Kansas, you love Kansas, it's the heart of the United States. They remind everybody that the heart is right there, and they don't want to be anywhere from there. Now, Craig may have rebelled a little bit because after he married a good Midwest girl, he ends up in Pasadena, California, where he's enjoying life today. But he's been influential in our industry, and when people want to know how good someone is, when you tell them that they won the Dunn Award from CII, that helps dictate this is the type of influence they've had in our industry. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Craig and welcome him to the podium.
Thank you. That's very kind. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm probably more pleased to be here than you will be pleased to have seen me here, but we'll see how that goes. I'm going to talk today about being in the envelope, but more importantly, what I think is wrong with that. And so let me start first by talking a little bit about where we are today, right? And as you know, I'm here about safety. That's really what I'm here to talk about. So what I'm going to talk about may apply to a lot of other things, actually, when you think about it, but I'm going to focus on safety. And I'm going to focus that in the context of what is the problem, or what I think might be the problem, and very much less on the solution. Because if we knew what to do, we'd all done it, and there wouldn't be need for me to stand up here and have this conversation. But think about where we are today. We got this safety thing knocked. We got processes and procedures and rules. We got training and development for our people. I mean, we are in the envelope in the classic sense of the way a pilot would think about it. Everything's in the green. We're right where we want to be. But we're not. And let me show you a little data that I think you saw already today for what that means and what I think that means to us. So here's the TRIR data, and you can see that we're doing a great job of coming down the slope and not getting to zero. We go through long periods where we don't make any significant improvement at all, and then sometimes we seem to have a little step change, and then we have long periods where we don't make any improvement at all, and there's no reason to think, looking at this curve, that we'll ever see zero. When you look at this curve, the story's even worse, right? In 10 years, you could argue that we've made zero progress. 10 years. 10 years for the smartest people in the room, right? By definition. But 10 years for a lot of really smart people trying really hard to eliminate injuries and accidents, and we're not getting there. Here's the scariest one of all. Right? This is fatalities in the U.S. in the construction industry and the CII fatality issues, which are global. Neither story is good. Again, no progress in years for the industry. In fact, if anything, slightly worse. And frankly, the last 2 or 3 years for CII have not been things that I think we're very proud of. You can really look at it just in that one way. In the industry, in the United States alone, in the last 10 years, 10,000 deaths. And so what I want to argue with you is that we're not getting done what we need to do, and that being in the envelope isn't sufficient. So maybe some of you have heard me tell the jaywalking story. I was very fond of this story over the last couple of years, and I'll repeat it just to give you the background. So when someone is jaywalking, when someone is crossing the street and not at an intersection, not at a crossroads, those people tend to be very alert, very aware, very defensive in their behavior because they know they're in a dangerous place. When people cross at an intersection, at a crosswalk, they tend to be much more comfortable that they're in a safe condition. In 2013, 4,700 pedestrians were killed in the United States. Over half of them were killed in and around crosswalks. Over half. So where people thought should have been the safest, if you believe all the rules and all the construction and the envelope that we put around crossing at an intersection, crossing at a crossroads, whether they were following all the rules or not, we actually killed more pedestrians there than anywhere. At least for 2013, that's the latest data I could find. And that says to me, something not right here. What is it that makes crossing at an intersection more dangerous than not? Right? And it has to be about the propensity of the person somehow. So sticking with automobiles and cars and those kinds of things, how many have been driving for, say, 30 years or so? Okay, most of us. I expect most of you remember that when you first started to drive, they told you that you needed to maintain a certain distance between the car in front of you and your car in order to be safe. And what I remember from my driver's ed was there were two versions of that. One was a number of car lengths dependent on your speed, and the other was what they called the 3-second rule. So if the car in front of you crossed a spot on the highway or a point on the pavement or whatever, and your car didn't cross that before 3 seconds had elapsed, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, then you were following an appropriate distance. A couple years ago, as a part of taking on a fairly routine set of retraining, driver's training stuff, I took a course again. And I was shocked by what I found. And this is what shocks me about it. Oh, this is the stopping distance of a Corvette. I picked the Corvette because it's a high-performance car, and again, also because I could find good data. And in 1967, a 427 Corvette took 135 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0. In 2015, a modern high-performance Corvette takes 90 feet. So a third less, or you can look at the other way, the Corvette takes half more, 50% more, to stop. Now, what did I learn in my new driver's ed training? I learned that 2 seconds is enough distance between me and the car in front of me. Now, why did we do that? If 3 seconds is a good safety margin, and now you have a better performing vehicle or tool, because your car will stop faster, it's got ABS, it's got big old disc brakes, it's got whatever it's got, why would we reduce the recommended distance? Well, it's been suggested that we have a risk tolerance, a perceived level of risk we're willing to take, and if we can drive 2 seconds back and think of ourselves as safe, we'll just do that. We'll change the rules to make it okay to be closer because the car stopped better. And we'll obliterate any safety benefit that we might have gotten. I just bought a new car personally, and it's got one of these electronic distance things that keeps me, in theory, if I've turned it on, from running into the guy in front of me. And it's a scary thing in California traffic because, you know, people changing lanes can cause the car to brake suddenly and unexpectedly. So I don't use it very much, but if I get in the HOV lane where people aren't coming in and I'm not going in and out, I turn it on just because it's interesting to see what happens. And as a part of this talk, I was in the car the other day, I turned the Distronic on, I'm following another car, and I decided I would measure how many seconds between when the car in front of me passed its point and I did when the Distronic was operating. 1.4 seconds. So where are we headed? More cars on the road, fewer lanes, more willingness to take risk. We're going to have lots of people with their Distronic cars at 1.4 seconds. A lot of us driving manual cars at 2 seconds. And someone is going to be tooling down the road in their 67 Vet, and they can't get far enough away from the car in front of them for fear somebody gets in front of them. And all because something about the way we think about risk is inconsistent with raising safety, with increasing safety. Let me give you another example. I hate this when my computer goes off. Here's a data point. This is a fairly old data point. But in the UK, they changed the law. And they began to require that children have seat belts when they were riding in the back seat of a vehicle. So this data compares the year before that law was passed to the year after that law was passed. And what you see here is comparing those 2 years, the number of fatalities among children riding in the back seat rose 10%. And the number of injuries for children riding in the back seat rose 12%. Meanwhile, injuries in general, both of all kinds, children and everyone else, only rose 6%. More miles being traveled, more vehicles on the road. But when the comparison, I think, is very meaningful. If you just take the injured, why would the number of injuries to children in the back seat double in terms of its increase compared to injuries in general? What is it about our behavior that changed? There's something, again, going on here that has to do with the willingness of all of us to accept risk. And there's acres of data like this, more and more and more of it. In fact, if you look at the data, there's plenty of data on motorcycle helmets and on bicycle helmets. And just to take a quick sidebar on bicycle helmets. Everybody believes today wearing a bicycle helmet's a good idea. I agree with them, even though the data doesn't necessarily support that results in fewer injuries. But did you know there's 2 kinds of bicycle helmets? The less expensive ones are rigid helmets. The more expensive ones have a feature inside that lets the helmet rotate relative to the head if you happen to fall and strike the helmet at an angle. The difference in your chances of being killed or paralyzed are huge. How many of you know about the difference in the helmets? 1, 2, 5, maybe 10 people out of 500. It's interesting, the first time I learned about that was 2 days after my city councilman was killed falling off a bike in a conventional helmet. So there is something going on here. When I think about it, I started trying to think about it in the context of, okay, what do we do today for safety? Or what have we done? What's some of the practices that have been historical? And some of the practices that I think about are the incident inquisition, right? Management gets together and we take a hard look at every accident that takes place in the company and we figure out who's the problem, right? What's the root cause? Who's to blame? I don't think that's going to affect the problem that I'm describing here. I hear a lot of talk about, well, if we just get people to do the right thing, right? The right way, every time, we won't have any injuries. And there's an underlying belief that our processes and our systems and our procedures and our tools are inherently going to work. And all we got to do is follow. And when we don't follow them, something wrong with our training, there's something wrong with the people, and that kind of brings us to the next aspect of that, which is, well, our problem is we got bad people. If we only had good people, nobody would get hurt. And I don't believe that's it either. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that not having good systems and processes and procedures and tools and personnel and protective equipment is a good idea. It's not a good idea. Although, can you imagine what it'd be like to drive if every steering column had a 10-inch spike on it and no airbags? Certainly change the behavior of drivers, wouldn't it? I'd drive way slower than I do today. But I don't think that I think all of this may be necessary, but I'm just not convinced it's sufficient. There's a big discussion, probably one that's been more recent, where you just have to get the right people. Get the right people with the right risk tolerance, get the right people with the right attitude, just go somehow figure out which ones in their heads, where you can't really see, are going to be good people. And when we put processes and procedures in place to help us do that. So again, we have training and activities around that. We get a job site full of people who are doing nothing but monitoring whether other people are following the rules or not, whether other people are good people or not, right? And we have zero tolerance policies where, one mistake and you're fired, right? And again, I'm not suggesting that any of those things aren't useful and aren't helpful, but when I look at our data, they're clearly not sufficient. There's something still missing. Part of it, I think, is this business of risk recognition and awareness, right? That goes back to why I liked the jaywalking story so much, because it does give a perspective on how you think about risk under two different environments. But what I didn't really come to understand as completely was, what does it mean to a person or a group or a culture if you reduce the apparent level of risk? So I did some research, been looking at this for a little while now, and I found a book and an author that spent the entire book explaining why it's impossible. Now, his insight, in my opinion, the guy's name is John Adams. The book was actually written in 1995. His insight into behaviors around risk is really good. When it comes to asking him what to do about it, he has no recommendations of any substance. But these are two of his insubstantial recommendations, which I thought were worth us thinking about, talking about. First, safety interventions, if they don't change the propensity to take risk, don't result in better performance, right? They're just going to go back to where we were. And I think the one example I've already given, we all can easily understand, is how close do you follow, right? We've gotten safer cars, we just follow closer because there's a level of risk we're comfortable with, right? And if you don't get people to reduce the way they look at risk, then all you're doing is moving it around. It's not actually you're not actually creating a safer environment. If you can wade through what is probably one of the more obtuse books I've ever read, I mean, it's a grind. It took me days to get through this one, and I read a book or two a day sometimes. So I'm not actually recommending you read it unless you really are into self-flagellation. But I can tell you, having done so, that the case for this question of how do we get people to change their propensity to take risks is, I think, maybe one of the central questions that we as a group should be thinking about if we really want to see zero incidents and injuries going forward. So what do we need? And I told you at the beginning I don't have the answers, so I'm going to share some speculations here. I'm going to give you some ideas about what I think might work or might help, and I'm going to have to leave it to you to go figure it out. And when I retired, I told my wife I really liked the CEO gig, so I was going to be CEO of our family, and she was going to be employee number one. You can imagine how well that's worked out for me. So I don't really have a platform to try these concepts out on anymore. I'm going to have to rely on all of you to do that. But I think if we're going to get where we want to be, we have to think about our relationship to failure differently. The inquisition's got to go away. You know, you can either shame and blame or learn and grow from what happens, as Jay Greenspan would put it, because I got that concept from Jay. And they're not, you just can't do both. It's either a blame and shame game or it's not. And if it's not, then you're starting to get that new relationship. You can learn and improve. We have to stop thinking there's only one root cause to an event. I know we all love root causes. I mean, it's in our nature as business people, as leaders, as engineers, as contractors. We're problem solvers, and part of being a problem solver is figuring out what caused the problem. And in most cases, what we're going to discover is what caused the problem was you. And that's not going to work. Right? There is no one root cause. People make mistakes. Human being makes mistakes. Our procedures and processes, as good as they are, as good as we can make them, are never going to be adequate. We live in a world of incredible scale and complexity. Think about some of the projects that people have talked about already in these sessions, and you get a feel for just how complex it all is. And we can't realistically, in my opinion, rely on procedures and processes and tools and rules to get us through that. We've got to change the relationship that we have to our expectations of processes, procedures, and rules. And we have to realize we have our own biases, right? I mean, we've all grown up with our own set of beliefs about safety, about what level of risk's acceptable. You know, I was talking with Jacobs executives before I retired, and we were testing this program where you actually put your workers through a psychological survey and determine whether they have a high propensity to take risk, and then you don't hire the ones that have a high propensity to take risk. And it's not entirely clear to me from the data I've seen whether that works or doesn't work, but you know, there's data, certainly there's data that supports that concept. And I'm not sure some of what I've said today wouldn't support that concept. On the other hand, I explained to that same group of executives, if they could pass the test, they couldn't work for me. Because I can't afford a bunch of executives who are afraid of risk. That's just the nature of our lives. We live with it every day. So I think the perspective has to be different. And we've got to recognize our own biases. I think we've got to think differently. And I got some examples where I think that's happening that are, I believe, ones that, I believe, that, in fact, I know in some cases, that they're producing better results. So one example is one that I first learned about from Ross Meyer at American Infrastructure. And they call it Praise the Day. And every day, at the end of the workday, they engage their people, all of their people, to talk about what went well and what went poorly, what surprised them, what changed, what could they have done better, and to talk about what is tomorrow going to be like. And I think it has, and I think if Ross were here, he would tell you, it's had a very profound effect on how his people behave and the culture of his organization and the results, both in terms of safety and productivity, that he achieves. Jacobs, we stole that idea directly from Ross, and we put it in a thing called Jacobs Way. We've piloted it on a couple of projects now to very significant success, both from a safety standpoint and a productivity standpoint. And it's all about that engagement of people in being a part of the culture, right? Another example, Brian Acton at BWC, sorry, got that a little bit wrong, has a program called the 2-minute drill. And he encourages his team to not step back, that's my term, but to just pause and think about what they're doing and what's changed, and has that changed the risk profile, and what they can do about those things. And again, I think that builds the culture that we're talking about. Jacobs is implementing a similar program called Step Back. And again, the idea is to get the team of people doing the work to engage in part of the thinking about it and be able to step back and assess what's going on. And I think those concepts, at least those two, are ones where they're starting to address this issue of getting at the culture and the beliefs of the people and the organization in a way that can change this dynamic and result in significantly better safety performance. I think there's something there. I think when you change expectations, that's the sort of accomplishment or process you can make. Now, proof of all that's still in the pudding, and I still feel like there's stuff missing. I don't know what it is. I don't have a prescription. But I just think there's something here in understanding how people and cultures relate to safety that we're not getting enough leverage. And I think more programs like American Infrastructures and like BMWC's are going to get us much, much closer to that ideal of where we are. I think that building a culture where the risk of breaching the culture is more significant to you than taking the risk of doing the work improperly is in there somewhere too. If the culture is strong about what it means to be safe, if the culture is strong about the propensity to take risk, then violating the culture is a risk in its own right, and we start to get that counterbalance. But without that culture, without those beliefs, I don't think you have the leverage to drive the change. So, again, I'll wind up just by saying this. I don't think being in the envelope is ever going to be sufficient. We've been there for some time. We work hard to make the envelope tighter and better and more effective, and we get incremental improvements, small incremental improvements, or none at all. And our need here is for a step change. Our need here is to get everyone as a part of the solution. Our need here is to get the culture of our organizations, our work groups, our people, to be that culture of caring. When Jacobs put together its safety program, it called it Beyond Zero, a culture of caring. And I didn't really realize how important that last part of that would be. But I really think there is something there for all of us if we can just figure out how to make it work. And it's on all of you to figure that out. Thank you.